So, good evening and good afternoon, everyone. I am Ravi Prakash, and I'm strategy lead at Sustainable Living Lab. I have been learning about futures thinking for quite some time, but still, I would say I am a beginner. And this has been a very interesting journey for me, which has not only helped me plan and pave the way for my company, but also plan out my personal life. Today, we are joined by Mr. Veerappan Swaminathan, founder and director of Sustainable Living Lab. And I hope that by today's session, we keep exploring this topic further. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Mr. Veerappan Swaminathan, who has been a circular economy enthusiast and a futurist for over a decade. And he has been using his engineering skills in a productive way to bring about a social change, especially in Southeast Asia. And being a pioneer of the maker movement and a futurist for over a decade, he was successful in establishing the maker culture in Asia, thus promoting and enabling a sustainable future. So I would like to say that I'm handing over the mic to Mr. Swaminathan, but it's just not possible in the current scenario. So I will mute myself and let Mr. Swaminathan talk and enlighten us about futures thinking. And how do we navigate uncertainties in this time where everything seems so dynamic and news keeps coming up every day?
All right, thanks very much, Ravi, for the introduction. So what I hope to do today is basically share with you a little bit about futures thinking. It's a fairly big topic, so I will try my best to keep it to time and also to make sure that you walk away with something today. Futures thinking is, I came across it when I was working at the Prime Minister's office in Singapore. I was in this department that was called the Strategic Policy Office. And what they did in this department was that they would make, long-term horizon plans for the country. And they would think in terms of 10 to 15 years time, how, what might happen in the world, and also ultimately how should Singapore as the country respond to that. And I found that really, mind-blowing when I first came across it. The idea that, you don't have to let the future happen to you, but that you can do something about it. And particularly now in this time and age where you have a sense of loss of control, and really because things are happening, almost spinning out of control. You don't know when they'll be allowed to move again. You don't know when you can go back to work again. And there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And even after this movement order is lifted, and then no one's very sure where the economy will go, whether the industries will remain as they are or will change completely. Now, everyone expects some change, but the question is what might change and how do you prepare yourself for that? So, I find that futures thinking can be a fairly productive way to mentally prepare yourself in uncertain times. And these are definitely uncertain times. So we are organizing this webinar in relation to a project called Futures Plus, which we are running as Sustainable Living Lab. And in fact, this particular webinar is the first webinar in the series. So Futures Plus itself is a community innovation program. Our goal is to develop 100 pilot projects that address sustainability challenges. And one of the really interesting things that we're going about doing this is that we want to introduce futures thinking and foresight into the way we develop community innovation projects. So this first webinar on futures thinking is to introduce to you what we mean when we say foresight driven. So my background, I'm currently the founder and director of Sustainable Living Lab. And I was previously, as I said, in the Singapore Prime Minister's office. I'm also a fellow of the US State Department YCLE program, as well as Inc. India. And in 2018, I received an award for my futures work in Asia. And I'm also a futures advisor for Connect Global, which is the largest corporate real estate association in the US. So I'm currently based in Singapore, and I used to travel quite regularly, in fact, every 2 weeks, to my other offices, SL2 has offices in Indonesia and India as well. But of course, all that has stopped right now, and we're completely working online. So it's always good. I mean, I meet my colleagues regularly, but this is the first time we're doing a webinar in this context. So Sustainable Living Lab itself, as an organization, we basically design and implement innovation projects that create both social and business value. And the way we do this is by introducing new ways of thinking, new ways of innovating, and of course, new technologies. And we co-create sustainable solutions. Right now, our industry areas are in education, are in manufacturing, and are also in things like agriculture as well. So we do a lot of different work. Over 10 years, we have done many different kinds of projects, but ultimately we are about facilitating a great conversation and action. So futures thinking, let's get down to it. What is it? It's essentially a methodology that involves critical thinking and strategic foresight. So let's break that down. Firstly, it's a method, right? It is not a thing, right? It's a method, it's a process. It's like design thinking, right? There is a sequence to it, it's a method to it. Except this method is maybe not as popularly known as design thinking, right? And you'll see why later, right? And the second part of it is that it involves critical thinking. So a lot of things that we do, which is thinking, is really about thinking much deeper and not taking things at face value, right? So if you see something is happening, you don't want to take it at face value. You instead want to look at it critically. And the last part is strategic foresight. So what does that mean? It means that to have foresight means to know what's happening before it hits you, right? And strategic foresight is aligning your actions today on that basis. So futures thinking brings all those things together. Now you can obviously understand why, from a country government standpoint, many countries have futures units. In fact, there are futures units at the PMO in India. In fact, there are also futures work being done in Indonesia. I'm not sure about Bhutan where there's futures work being done there, but in many countries around the world, futures thinking is an essential part of governance structures. Now, what's happening these days is that businesses, companies, and even individuals are taking note of this and are trying to figure out how they can use some of these methods to prepare and plan for an uncertain future. So first thing I must say that our job here is not to do what they call crystal ball gazing, right? We're not trying to predict a single particular future. That's not what this is about. I will be very, very distrustful of anybody says that, oh, I predict X, Y, and Z things will happen. We are not astrologers here. We're not horoscope writers. We're not going to predict a single future. Instead, it's about being prepared for multiple futures. See, let's say option A happens, option B happens, or option C happens. It's being prepared for any of those options, right? But obviously, you can't prepare yourself for every single option out there because there are infinite options. In fact, you want to prepare yourself for what are the most plausible options, right? And there's something that we use in this case is called a futures cone, right? So this basically is indicative, right? So I'm going to just walk you through what I mean when I show this diagram. So the blue color, right, it's the projected or probable future, right? It's what everyone thinks will happen. The gray area, the plausible area, that's what we are interested in. But to get the gray area, the plausible area, you actually have to look at what's possible in the first place, right? And then from there, identify what is going to be plausible, what could happen. And you want to plan for plausible futures. You want to plan for multiple plausible futures. All right, so I hope I make that very clear. We're not trying to prepare for a single future. We're trying to prepare for multiple plausible futures. Okay? So what is futures thinking used for? People have used it in different ways. So sometimes they use it to anticipate what are things that will affect our society and environment. So in fact, sometimes you will say people using a comment, right, on the COVID-19, and they say that, hey, this COVID-19 is a black swan. Right? This term black swan is by a writer called Yuval Norris. Right? So he wrote a pretty interesting book that is called The Black Swan, and it reflects basically impossible events that could happen and change things. Now, is the COVID-19 an impossible thing? Is it a black swan? Some would say yes, but many will actually say no, because for a long time, we know that our global system is really susceptible to pandemics. And that's because we have global air travel, we have very little, good healthcare systems across the board. In fact, some countries' healthcare is completely privatized, some countries completely socialized. So we have many different health systems with different kind of income levels in different countries, which affect our ability, to actually monitor any pandemic outbreaks and so on. So in a way, one could say that a pandemic was bound to happen, right? Something of this kind was bound to happen. And in fact, as late as early back as 2000 thing, 9 or so, right? I mean, back then we had the SARS. So 2004 we had the SARS incident that happened, and SARS was our taste of our first global pandemic. And even back then, they were saying that look, the next one will come pretty soon, right? And here we are, 2020, we have the next one right after SARS. In between, in fact, we had the H1N1 as well. So the ability to anticipate emerging trends is something that people use futures thinking for. The second thing is to build powerful vision, right? So if you want to really rally people and you want to rally them to do great things, you got to get them to be able to dream. And to dream, that means to have a picture of the future. But how do you build that picture of the future to get people to dream? Futures thinking can be used to do that. You can also use it to drive change in the organization, inspire new ideas, which is what we are using for. We're also using it to stimulate product and service innovation, right? In the Futures Plus program, we'll be using futures thinking to stimulate product, service, and system innovation, come up with new things, interesting products, services. And of course, many governments use it to identify risk and opportunities and also strengthen long-term planning. Now, as an individual, you can use it to definitely identify risks, but also identify many opportunities and build a powerful vision for yourself. So that's what I hope you can do with futures thinking. So today's session, taken as an introduction to the world of futures thinking, right? There are a lot of great books in this area. I can share some of them with you later. There are also great resources that you can find online as well. So a typical futures journey, I said it was a method, right? So, design thinking as a method has 5 stages. So futures thinking as well has some stages to it. Now, here's the thing. Nobody has come out and said that this is the futures thinking method. The thing about futurists is they're all pretty humble, right? The thing about studying futures is that you become pretty sure that you're unsure of everything, right? And as such, no one's ever going to tell you, hey, this is the way to do futures thinking. And I'm not going to be the first one to tell you that either, right? Now, what I can tell you, however, is that there are some typical ways in which people undertake the journey of studying a particular future or futures. First thing they do is they scan, right? As the binoculars suggest, you want to be always keeping a lookout for what's happening out there. And you want to be pretty systematic and diverse in your approach. Now, looking out for things means reading things on the papers, on the news, talking to people who know better than you. It means not being content to sit within your own filter bubble on the Facebook wall or your Instagram and so on, right? It means actually going out there and seeking information. You gotta be a truth seeker, right? Now, when you scan and you find things, you're not gonna find all true things, right? So obviously you got to, apply a bit of a critical thinking and identify by mapping it, right? That's the second stage, by mapping some of these things they found about what's important, what's critical, what's uncertain, what's immediate, what's long-term. So by mapping out what these drivers, these of change are, and identifying which ones are important to you, that's the next step that people will take, right? Mapping it. Now, after you mapped it, you need to go back and say, look, let's try and make deeper sense of these things. So now we have mapped all the things that we see at the superficial level. But here's the thing, for everything that happens at the superficial level, there's some deeper underlying reason why that takes place. So sense making is where we try and look under the iceberg, right? Try and look under the iceberg, under the tip of the iceberg, and see what is actually happening in those issues that we've identified. Fourth is building scenarios of plausible futures, as I shared earlier. And of course, last is testing your personal strategy that will be able to survive multiple plausible futures. So you want to create a strategy that is able to be relevant despite any of the 2 or 3 or 4 plausible futures that might occur. Right? You don't want to develop a strategy is only suitable for one future. You want to develop a strategy that's suitable for multiple possible futures. So that's what I was sharing, right? So that's the idea of futures thinking. Now let me give you an example of what I mean by scanning, right? So when we say scanning and we talk about looking for information, there's some clever ways to do this, right? So one way is you can look at a steep V or steep indicators, and that means looking for information sources on the basis of social trends, technological trends, economic trends, environmental trends, political trends, and of course trends in changing values. So let's take, for example, the future economy or the future economy in a particular country. And we want to look at what are the social trends that are telling us how it will impact the future economy. So one thing we'll know for sure is that the social trends is that people are going to be gathering a lot less, right? People are going to be traveling a lot less. Social connections as we know it will become much more independent. Now, will that impact on the economy? For sure, right? The idea of going to socialize in restaurants and whatever and so on, that might look very different in the future. What about technological trends? Technological trends can be things like, right now in many countries, they're coming up with very interesting facial recognition software. They're coming up with very interesting ways to trace, where you have been, contact tracing using your Bluetooth on your phone. And it's becoming very widely accepted. In the past, people would say, hey, this technology exists, but it was not widely accepted. Today, it's become normal to expect there to be intrusive Bluetooth tracking technology to know where you went. And it's seen as a public good to have that as well. And then economic trends itself, you'll find that economies are becoming much more self-reliant, self-sufficient. When people wanted to buy masks, they realized that, hey, when the COVID situation happening in China, they weren't exporting any masks. So if you want your critical supplies, you got to manufacture it yourself at home, right? That trend has definitely started being viewed everywhere as being important. So even in a country like Singapore, where we import most of our things, we have decided to manufacture masks. Now, this is the country in which land is really expensive in Singapore. So most manufacturing has moved out to other low-cost countries. And yet they're bringing back manufacturing to a very expensive country because they realize that, look, it is no longer an economic argument for this, right? It's about survival, it's about resilience. I got to bring the mass production back, into a high-cost country. And so that will definitely reshape the economic landscape for sure. They also find things like, the environment, right? Many ways nature is coming back, right? You'll find that people take pictures of horses, sheep, otters running about on the streets. You're finding the air is getting a lot cleaner. People are saying, hey, in the past, did we really live so badly? Do we maybe want to bring back some of these, benefits that we had by having less pollution? And I think people's opinion of these things might change. In political terms, suddenly, you find what is the importance of having good governance. And you also see what is the outcome of having bad governance, right? In countries which have bad governance, you'll see what has happened. People are maybe going to say, I think it's going to matter how I vote. I shouldn't just stay home during elections. Maybe I should go and vote. Maybe I should participate in the political process. So these are definitely trends that are happening. And you also find that values are changing, right? When you're all forced to be stuck at home, people are saying, hey, what about essential workers? Are we really taking care of them? Who's actually essential in this economy? Are we respecting them? Are we paying them well enough? Are we paying our teachers well? When you're doing home-based learning or remote learning, parents realize how hard it is actually to take care of kids, to teach children, right? And so values around respect for educators, that changes. Values around who we deem as essential and unessential changes. So in many ways, when we look for news on the basis of these steep indicators, it helps us get a very diverse viewpoint, right? So one way that we do scanning well is we try and have a wide view and sort of keep a look for trends and issues affecting what we care about, along these different dimensions. The next one is on mapping. So mapping is basically, once you have found all those drivers of change, for example, you want to ask yourself, right, what is the direct consequence of that on the issue that I care about? What is the second order indirect consequence of that, and so on? So typically what will happen is that you will pick some of the more interesting drivers of change that you have found out through your scanning, and you'll try and think through what are the first order and second order implications of it. And those that are interesting, basically say, hey, that's something I want to study more about. Now, once you have mapped it, you want to sense make it. You want to take some of those more interesting, maps and say that, let's look deeper into this thing. So how do you look deeper? So one tool is called the causal layer analysis. So there are many sense-making tools out there. This one is developed by Dr. Sohail Inatullah. So Dr. Sohail Inatullah is a very, very famous futurist. And in fact, he is a Pakistani who lives in Australia, and as a futurist, he has consulted governments all over the world. And he came up with this tool called a causal layer analysis. And that basically, it's a way of unpacking a particular change is happening. So first thing is that for everything that happens, there is the official description of it, right? There's what they call a litany, tip of the iceberg. But below that, and that's what we're interested in, is in what are the systemic causes of that. What is the worldviews that allow for the system to happen or be created in that way in the first place? And what are the myths and metaphors driving that particular worldview? So for example, you find that healthcare systems, right, in US, for example, right now is failing to control the coronavirus. And if you look below that, why is the healthcare system in that way? It's because the worldview of the American health people is that healthcare is a responsibility of the individual, not of the state. And if you say, why is that the case? Why do they have that worldview? Because there is the American myth of the value of independence, the value of freedom, the value of privacy, and so on. And so what they want to do is that they want to say that, hey, Americans, we got to take care of ourselves. We came from the past of a Wild West and so on. So, you're on your own, right? And you can't be going looking for the government to help you with stuff and all that. And you can almost understand, why, the whole big American myth of the Wild West and so on has led to a situation where people feel like having a national healthcare system to tackle problems like the coronavirus is something they don't really want. It almost sounds crazy from some other countries when we look at these things, but when you start looking at myth and metaphor, you can begin to understand why they're thinking that way. And why is it important to understand this? Because if you want to create change, it is not just about creating change at a system level. It's about creating change at the myth metaphor level. It's about changing worldview. It's about changing discourse, about how people see things. But a lot of social change, especially, is very, very deeply set in the myths and metaphors and the stories that we tell ourselves. And if you want to see change in the way people act, you got to first change the stories they tell themselves. Now, next step is scenario building. So scenario building is basically once we have studied some of the drivers, and we say that, hey, what are some possible drivers that are interesting to us that we think are most relevant, and let's build options, right? What could happen? And generally for scenarios, there are 4 archetypes, as they call it, right? 4 possible type scenarios. So one scenario is what they call the growth scenario. So the growth scenario is where in which the system moves in its current trajectory, right? It just carries on as it is. The second archetype is that of constraint, right? Where a system reaches a new balance, right? Because it's a new normal, it reaches a new balance, but still, there are some competing forces as well. The third archetype is that of a complete transformation, where the old system is discarded completely in favor of a new one. And the fourth is that of collapse, where a system that we know of it today completely falls apart. So usually we would try and build scenarios, 4 different kinds of scenarios, and we'll say that, hey, okay, next, let's look at a strategy that we're going to develop and make sure the strategy is able to survive any of these 4 scenarios, right? So that brings us to the final step, that of strategy. And for strategy, it's basically about coming up with ideas, testing it against your scenarios, right? and that means building new products and solutions. That means the whole innovation process. So I'm going to give you a real example of how this has happened. So Institute for the Future is a very famous organization that does a lot of great work in futures thinking, right? And essentially, the Institute for the Future, this particular piece of work that in fact came out today, right? So in support of with the support of Blue Shield of the California Foundation and the James Levine Foundation, they created a recipe guide to imagine possible futures, right? And some of the drivers and they looked at were changes in the value systems. So if you look at the blue on the right-hand side, they found that in how people responded to the COVID-19 crisis, there were differing values towards the utility of the public system or the private system, an open system or a closed system, focusing on growth or keeping things as they are, focusing on the individual or focusing on the collective as a group, and so on and so forth, right? So on the basis of these different trends and driving forces, they created 4 alternative futures. I'm going to show you this to give an idea of what alternative futures can look like, right? And this might be familiar to some of you. So this first future is that of growth, right? It's a growth future, and in this, it's basically about economic priorities. It's basically about keeping things as they are, right? So what you see in some countries is there's a rush to reopen, right? Like you see in the US, for example, and there is belief that hey, if we open slowly, we'll fall behind, and so you get a sense of slow and unequal regrowth, and essentially, you'll find that there's some industries that will boom for sure, right? So the biotech industry will boom for sure. And also you'll find that there will be more vigilance, right? So whoever's involved in things like surveillance, vigilance, and so on, that will grow as well. So in this particular future, you have some areas of growth, and of course you have some areas of problems, right? So for example, since a lot of people can't go to work and all that, automation will increase in speed, right? Because for low-paid jobs that people are not going to work for, today you'll find that there are burger flipping robots. Now, people didn't invest in these in the past because they thought it was cheaper to hire someone. But if the someone, even though they're cheaper, they can't go to work because of health issues, then they'll say, you know what, it's maybe good to invest in robots. So we end up accelerating the move towards automation, right? Especially in the low-income sector. So in all futures, there's definitely good things and bad things. So the bad things here is that all the inequities that were identified as the cause of COVID-19 will continue without much significant change, right? And in fact, you notice that in China, for example, they have this app where you can either have a green tick mark, yellow tick mark, or red tick mark, and it sort of gives you certain privileges to go to certain places and all that. It's almost like immunoprivilege, right? If you have COVID and you're immune to it, then maybe you have access to every place. If you don't, you have limited access and so on. So you end up, becoming a state that has a new class system, right? The class system is that of your health status. So that's one possible scenario, right? And we may have think that we don't really want this scenario, we want this scenario, but the point here is that that might happen. And the point here is that, as we think of strategies, we want to be prepared that if that first scenario comes to pass, our strategy is still able to survive that. Now, another scenario is that of the constraint scenario, right? It means that, you find a new normal. So right now you find that in some places, people are really prepared, to flatten the curve, sacrifice the economy, in order to save people and so on. And so you find that, the idea of mutual aid, of having new social solidarity practices, of having universal basic income and so on, actually becomes normalized. And you also find that in this day and age, there's a lot of volunteerism as well, right? There are people who are stepping out to volunteer more so than they usually would, for example. And in this particular future, you find that, there might be things like a living wage, for example. In fact, a good initiative is that, so if you notice, right, I'm not sure how you guys are familiar with the Singapore system here, but we recently had a law passed that said that, hey, all those who are unemployed due to the lockdown, basically you're going to be eligible for income support, right? If you lost your gig economy jobs. So for example, you lost your contract, so on, the government will basically pay you for 8 months. This is quite radical if you think about it, because it's essentially a universal basic income without quite using the words universal basic income. You're essentially saying that you're going to pay people a certain amount of money in order to pull them through the crisis. And this might become much more normal, right? As we find automation, as we find some of these changes, putting more and more people out of work, it might become normalized to actually provide a basic living wage. And you also find things like service infrastructure improving, more investment in government. You'll find there to be more protection of open media. So a bunch of these things could happen in this particular future. And in the third possible future that I identified was one in which there are it's sort of a future in which there are limits to growth and there are fewer jobs and so on as well, right? So you find a lot of data coming in because of contact tracing and so on. It identifies the certain hubs of disease and all that. And so, for example, let's say, right, you have a situation where some countries say, hey, usually all these pandemics seem to originate from a particular group of people or a particular country or a particular region. And then they start isolating them on that basis, because the data that you reveal or collected indicates to you that's possible, right? It's possible to isolate people and so on. And so you again have a different kind of class system, right? Where there are some particular communities that interact with each other and some other communities cannot, and so on. So for this particular future, you'll find a global sort of class system on the basis of health safety, for example. So almost like a systematic discrimination sort of process that might happen. So again, no one is saying this will happen, but this is a possible outcome of that scenario. A fourth scenario, and this is a collapse scenario, is in which you see the worst of humanity happening, right? Today you have vigilantes enforcing masks. People take videos and photographs of you to shame you online or to dox you. Then you also have countries that are becoming really protectionist and saying that, hey, I want to, keep my stuff and so on. I don't want to send to you. I want to keep all my critical goods for myself. You're going to find societies dividing between urban and rural. The rural guys will say, look, all the urban guys have all these health problems, so you can't come into the village, right? And all the rural guys will isolate and will sort of, stay happily by ourselves because we have food, we can take care of ourselves. And sometimes in some countries, you might find that there may be secessionist tendencies, right? There will be domestic political problems as a result. People, decide to split up, to separate, and all that. So that's possibly a collapse, scenario that may happen. So I showed you 4 scenarios. I'm not saying any of these scenarios might happen, but I just want to give you an indication as to the kinds of possible scenarios that might happen. And in thinking of a strategy, right, for a future, we want to be looking at what strategy would be best suited regardless of either 4 of these scenarios. So if you think of personal strategy for yourself, how would you decide what kind of jobs to take up, for example, right? So that you will still have a job regardless of these 4 scenarios. If you had to pick a skills development mechanism, you say, I want to develop some skills, well, what skills should you develop? What skills will be useful in either of those 4 scenarios? Another way to look at it is as a change maker, if you wanted, if you have a particular scenario that you preferred, for example, how can you move towards that scenario and make the other scenarios that are less appealing, less likely to happen, right? So from a change maker standpoint, at SLDO, for example, we look at these things and say that, hey, I don't really want a collapse scenario. I don't really want a transformation scenario. I want a constraint scenario, right? And so we are really interested in how to make maybe a scenario like this happen. and make the other scenarios less likely instead. Right? So you want to think about what will make this scenario more likely. What kind of actions can we take to bring this to life? So that's what we'll be thinking about, right? So these are some of the scenarios I want to share with you to give you an idea of what this look like and how this helps decision making, right? So I leave you with one final question, right? What future will you create, right? So this question, I think, is central to future thinking. It's not about thinking as much as it's about deciding what you're going to do. It's about deciding what choices you're going to make, and not about letting the future happen to you, but instead saying that the best way to predict the future is to create it.